The Vampire King's autistic son hadn't spoken in 3 years until Emma started reading to him. Everyone thought it was just routine therapy. But when she dozed off mid-sentence and Marcus whispered, "Don't stop," in the darkness, his father realized this mortal woman held the key to breaking his heir's devastating silence. Emma's fingers trembled as she traced the address on her phone screen, checking it for the third time against the imposing wrought iron gates that stretched 12 feet high before her. The Drackle estate loomed behind them, like something pulled from a Gothic nightmare, all black stone and sharp angles cutting against the gray October sky. Gargoyles perched on corner towers, their stone eyes seeming to track her movement as she approached the intercom box mounted beside the gate. The wealthy Shadowmere district had always intimidated her, but this place felt different, wrong in ways her psychology training couldn't quite categorize. She pressed the brass button and waited, her breath visible in the unseasonably cold air. A woman's voice crackled through the speaker, sharp and formal. "Mrs. Corvina," she said, and the gate swung open with a grinding sound that seemed to echo longer than it should. Emma walked up the winding drive, her worn sneakers silent on the black gravel that crunched like broken glass beneath each step. No mirrors caught her reflection in the tall windows she passed, only blackout curtains drawn so tight they seemed sewn to the frames. Security cameras with glowing red lights swiveled to follow her progress, their mechanical whirring the only sound besides her own shallow breathing and the distant toll of what might have been church bells or something more ominous. The massive front door opened before she could knock, revealing a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of Emma's appearance in a single glance. Mrs. Corvina wore a black dress that belonged to another century, high-necked and long-sleeved despite the warm autumn day, and her pale skin had the translucent quality of someone who rarely saw sunlight. She gestured Emma inside without warmth, her movements precise and economical as she led the way through corridors lined with portraits whose subjects' eyes seemed to follow their passage. The air inside felt thick, heavy with the scent of old wood and something metallic that made Emma's nose wrinkle involuntarily. No staff members appeared in the hallways, but Emma caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, shadows that disappeared when she turned to look directly at them. Mrs. Corvina stopped before a heavy oak door carved with intricate symbols that might have been decorative or might have been something else entirely. Something older and more purposeful than mere ornamentation. The interview room beyond contained no windows, only gas lamps that cast flickering shadows across dark mahogany furniture and shelves, lined with books whose titles were written in languages Emma couldn't identify. Mrs. Corvina settled behind a desk that seemed too large for the space, and gestured for Emma to take the chair opposite, its red velvet upholstery worn smooth by countless previous occupants. The questions began immediately, sharp and probing in ways that had nothing to do with typical employment interviews. "How did Emma feel about working with unusual children?" Mrs. Corvina asked, her pale eyes never blinking. Could she maintain confidentiality about family medical conditions and what she termed ancestral traditions, speaking the words with a weight that suggested they meant far more than simple cultural practices? Would Emma be comfortable working exclusively nocturnal schedules, arriving at sunset and leaving before dawn, no exceptions ever? The pay she mentioned made Emma's breath catch in her throat. $500 per night. Cash, no taxes, no questions about how she spent her time outside the estate. It was more money than Emma had ever seen, enough to cover her mother's next round of chemotherapy treatments and maybe even the experimental therapy the insurance company refused to approve. Emma's hands shook as she signed the papers. Mrs. Corvina slid across the mahogany surface, document after document, filled with oddly specific clauses about maintaining silence regarding family medical conditions and respecting what were called ancestral traditions, words that seemed to glow in the lamplight as if written in ink that held its own luminescence. She tried to read the fine print, but the letters seemed to shift and blur whenever she focused too intently, leaving her with the strange sensation that she was agreeing to far more than she understood. Mrs. Corvina's expression softened almost imperceptibly as Emma signed the final page, something that might have been approval or might have been pity flickering behind her pale eyes. "The child you will be reading to has special needs," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He has not spoken in 3 years, not since his mother passed away under tragic circumstances. The doctors have tried everything, specialists from around the world, but Marcus remains locked in silence. Your job is simple in description, but may prove challenging in practice. Read to him, speak to him, treat him as you would any child who needs gentle care and patience. Do not expect responses, do not push for interaction, simply be present and consistent." Mrs. Corvina stood and walked to a cabinet Emma hadn't noticed before, its dark wood seeming to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it. From inside she withdrew a small velvet pouch that clinked softly as she set it on the desk. "Your first night's payment," she said, and Emma's fingers closed around the pouch with desperate gratitude. The coins inside felt heavier than modern currency, their surfaces etched with symbols that matched those carved into the door. "Tomorrow you begin," Mrs. Corvina continued, her tone returning to its earlier formality. "Arrive at sunset, no earlier, no later. Enter through the side door marked with the red stone, never the front entrance during working hours. Speak to no one except Marcus and myself unless directly addressed. And remember, Miss Chen, the confidentiality agreement you have signed is binding in ways that extend far beyond legal consequences." Emma nodded, not trusting herself to speak, clutching the velvet pouch like a lifeline. She rose from her chair and followed Mrs. Corvina back through the maze of corridors, past more portraits whose subjects seemed to whisper among themselves as she passed. The house felt alive around her, breathing and watching, walls that pulse with some rhythm she couldn't quite identify. At the front door, Mrs. Corvina paused, her pale hand resting on the ornate handle. "One final word of advice, Miss Chen. Children like Marcus exist in a world between worlds, caught in spaces most people cannot understand. If you wish to help him, you must be willing to step into that space yourself, to let go of your assumptions about what is possible and what is real. Are you prepared for that kind of commitment?" Emma met her eyes directly, feeling something shift inside her chest, a recognition she couldn't name but trusted completely. "My mother always said I was drawn to the lost ones," she said quietly. "The children other people give up on. If Marcus needs someone to believe in him, then I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Mrs. Corvina's smile was the first genuine expression Emma had seen from her, transforming her severe features into something almost motherly. "Then perhaps there is hope after all," she murmured, and opened the door to release Emma back into the dying light of evening. Emma walked down the gravel drive with quick steps, eager to return to her small apartment and process what had just occurred. She felt the weight of watching eyes on her back, but resisted the urge to turn around until she reached the iron gates. When she finally looked back at the Gothic mansion, her breath caught in her throat. In an upper window, pale as moonlight against the black glass, a child's face stared down at her with eyes that seemed far older than his apparent years. For a moment their gazes met across the distance, and Emma felt something pass between them, a recognition that made her chest tight with unexplained emotion. Then curtains snapped shut with violent finality, hiding the boy from view as if he had never been there at all. Emma stood frozen at the gates for long moments, staring up at the now empty window, feeling as if she had just glimpsed something forbidden, something that would change everything about what she thought she understood about the world. The evening air grew colder around her, shadows lengthening as the sun disappeared behind the Gothic towers, and she finally turned toward home with the strange sensation that she was leaving one life behind and walking toward another entirely. The coins in the velvet pouch clinked softly with each step, their weight a constant reminder that tomorrow she would return to this place of shadows and secrets to meet the silent boy whose face now haunted her thoughts. As she reached her car, Emma realized she had never asked Mrs. Corvina about the child's father, and somehow she suspected that omission had been deliberate, another piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. Emma arrived the following evening with a canvas bag filled with tactile books and sensory toys she had gathered from her university's psychology department, her heart racing with anticipation after Marcus's whispered words the night before. The side entrance marked with the red stone opened before she could knock, revealing Mrs. Corvina's familiar severe expression softened by what might have been cautious hope. "The boy spoke to you," she said without preamble, her pale eyes searching Emma's face for confirmation of what seemed impossible after 3 years of silence. Emma nodded, unable to suppress her smile as she described those precious 2 words in the darkness. And Mrs. Corvina's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly before she led Emma through corridors that seemed less oppressive than before, as if the house itself had exhaled some long-held breath. Marcus sat in the same chair as before, rigid and unblinking, but Emma caught something different in his posture, a subtle tension that suggested awareness rather than absence. She settled into her usual spot and began unpacking her supplies, explaining each item in the gentle voice that had become natural when speaking to him. A book with raised letters for tracing, soft fabric squares in different textures, a small stress ball that changed colors when squeezed. His pale eyes tracked her movements without moving his head, following the progression of objects across the mahogany table beside his chair. Emma opened her copy of The Secret Garden to where they had left off the previous night and began reading about Mary Lennox discovering the hidden door in the garden wall, her voice finding the same soothing rhythm that had worked before. As she read, she noticed Marcus's breathing had synchronized with the cadence of her words, his chest rising and falling in time with the story's natural pauses. When she reached the passage about Mary's excitement at finding something secret and wonderful, a soft humming sound escaped Marcus's throat, barely audible but unmistakably intentional. Emma's heart leaped, but she continued reading without acknowledging the sound directly, having learned from her psychology training that too much attention could cause a withdrawn child to retreat further. Instead, she began incorporating gentle touches as she read, resting her hand briefly on his shoulder when describing moments of comfort in the story, tracing letters on his palm when Mary learned to read the garden's hidden signs. Each touch seemed to send a tremor through Marcus's still form, not of rejection but of awakening, as if her contact was calling something dormant back to life. She didn't notice that her reflection failed to appear in the dark windows behind Marcus's chair, dismissing the absence as a trick of the lamplight and heavy curtains that blocked any glimpse of the world outside. Mrs. Corvina appeared silently in the doorway as Emma finished the evening's reading, carrying a small velvet box that she pressed into Emma's hands with unusual urgency. "For protection," she said cryptically, and Emma opened the box to find an ornate iron bracelet etched with symbols that matched those she had seen throughout the house. The metal felt warm against her skin as she fastened it around her wrist, heavier than its delicate appearance suggested. Marcus's eyes fixed on the bracelet with an intensity that made Emma's breath catch, and she realized he had been watching her face throughout the entire exchange with Mrs. Corvina, reading her expressions with an uncanny ability that seemed to penetrate straight to her emotions. When she felt surprise at his attention, his head tilted slightly, as if he had sensed the shift in her internal state. When she deliberately thought about feeling calm and safe, his rigid shoulders relaxed fractionally in response. The connection between them felt deeper than anything her textbooks had described, less like therapy, and more like some form of wordless communication that bypassed normal human channels entirely. As the week progressed, Emma found herself looking forward to these evening sessions with an anticipation that went beyond professional satisfaction. Marcus began making sustained eye contact, his pale eyes holding hers for longer moments each night, and she noticed he had started stimming when particularly engaged with the stories, his hands flapping in small, controlled movements that her training told her to celebrate rather than discourage. The first time it happened during a particularly exciting passage about Colin's first steps in the garden. Emma clapped her hands softly and told him how wonderful it was to see him expressing his feelings, and the smile that ghosted across his features was the most beautiful thing she had ever witnessed. His stimming became more frequent after that, a form of communication that told her when the stories resonated with him, when he felt safe enough to let his internal experience show externally. She began tailoring her reading choices to evoke these responses, selecting passages that dealt with discovery, healing, and the magic of connection between isolated souls. One evening, as she gathered her things to leave, Emma noticed deep scratches in the wood around Marcus's bedroom door, gouges that looked fresh and violent, as if something with claws had tried to break through the heavy oak. When she asked Mrs. Corvina about them the next night, the older woman's expression grew carefully neutral, as she explained that Marcus sometimes had digestive issues that caused him distress, and he occasionally acted out physically during these episodes. The explanation felt incomplete, especially when Emma noticed rust-colored stains on Marcus's sheets that Mrs. Corvina quickly bundled away before she could examine them more closely. The metallic scent she had noticed on her first visit seemed stronger in Marcus's room, clinging to the curtains and upholstery in ways that made her nose wrinkle involuntarily. But Marcus himself seemed healthier each night, more present and engaged, and Emma decided to trust the progress she could see rather than worry about mysteries she couldn't solve. Everything changed the evening Adrian Drackle finally revealed himself, appearing in the doorway of Marcus's room like something materialized from shadow and lamplight. Emma's first glimpse of him made her breath catch in her throat, not just because of his devastating beauty, but because of the way he seemed to command the very air around him, tall and elegant in perfectly tailored black clothing that emphasized the otherworldly pallor of his skin. His dark hair framed features that belonged in Renaissance paintings, all sharp angles and aristocratic bones, but his eyes held a weight of experience that seemed impossible for someone who appeared barely older than herself. He introduced himself as Marcus's father, recently returned from an extended business trip, and his voice carried the faintest trace of an accent she couldn't place, something that suggested old European nobility and formal education in languages that predated modern borders. Emma felt inexplicably nervous in his presence, not from fear, but from an awareness of power that seemed to radiate from him, like heat from a fire, making her acutely conscious of her own mortality in ways she had never experienced before. Adrian explained that Marcus's condition resulted from a combination of rare genetic disorders that required careful management of his environment, including the nocturnal schedule that kept him away from sunlight and the specialized diet that Mrs. Corvina prepared with ingredients Emma never saw arriving at the estate. He spoke of Marcus's needs with clinical precision, but she caught glimpses of deep emotion carefully controlled beneath his composed exterior. The way his hands clenched when he described his son's trauma. The brief flash of pain that crossed his features when he mentioned his late wife. Emma noticed that Adrian never ate or drank anything during their conversations, claiming stomach problems that required him to maintain strict dietary restrictions, and his skin held the same translucent quality as Mrs. Corvina's, as if neither of them spent any time in natural sunlight. When a heavy lamp began to topple from a side table during one of their conversations, Adrian's hand shot out with impossible speed to catch it before it could crash to the floor, his reflexes so quick that Emma's eyes couldn't track the movement. He covered the moment by claiming unusually good reflexes from years of martial arts training, but Emma filed the incident away with all the other small mysteries that surrounded the Drackle family. Despite her growing suspicions about the true nature of Marcus's condition, Emma couldn't deny the positive changes she witnessed each night. The boy's connection to his father was immediately apparent. the way his rigid posture relaxed when Adrian entered the room, how his eyes tracked his father's movements with obvious affection even when he couldn't speak. Adrian seemed to communicate with Marcus through subtle gestures and shared glances, a private language developed over years of necessary silence. Emma began staying later each evening, often finding herself dozing in the comfortable chair beside Marcus's bed as she read to him. The first time she woke to find Marcus gently stroking her hair with fingers that felt unnaturally cold against her scalp, she should have been concerned about appropriate boundaries, but something about the gesture felt natural and comforting rather than inappropriate. He seemed to sense when she was troubled about her mother's worsening condition or stressed about university deadlines, offering these small comforts without words. Her dreams during these brief naps grew increasingly vivid, filled with images of Gothic castles and shadowy figures that felt more like memories than imagination. She began to suspect that Marcus only truly rested during daylight hours, as she never found him sleeping during their evening sessions no matter how late she stayed. One night, while searching for a bathroom, Emma accidentally discovered Adrian's private study, its walls lined with legal documents written in multiple languages, many bearing official seals and signatures that looked centuries old rather than contemporary. She glimpsed references to vampire-human treaties and custody agreements before guilt forced her to retreat, but not before she noticed a large oil painting dominating one wall that made her blood freeze in her veins. The woman in the portrait had Emma's exact features, from the shape of her eyes to the curve of her smile, so perfect a match that it could have been Emma herself posing in period costume from another era. The nameplate read, Isabel Dracul, beloved wife and mother, and the dates listed a death that coincided exactly with Marcus's onset of selective mutism 3 years earlier. Emma fled the study with her heart pounding, understanding for the first time that her resemblance to Marcus's mother was not coincidental, but part of some larger pattern she was only beginning to comprehend. The next evening brought Emma's first panic attack in months, triggered by a phone call from the hospital about her mother's deteriorating condition and the insurance company's continued refusal to approve the experimental treatments that might save her life. She found herself sobbing in Marcus's room, unable to maintain the professional composure she usually brought to their sessions. Adrian appeared within moments as if summoned by her distress, settling beside her with unexpected gentleness and offering comfort in a voice that seemed to resonate through her bones. His presence calmed her racing heart in ways that defied rational explanation, and when his cool hand touched her forehead, she felt safer than she had in months, protected by something far more powerful than normal human strength. Marcus watched this interaction with obvious fascination, mimicking his father's protective posture and reaching out to pat Emma's arm with the same careful gentleness Adrian had shown. It was the most initiative Emma had seen from the boy, proof that he was learning to recognize and respond to others' emotional needs through watching his father's example. The family dynamic that emerged during this crisis felt natural despite its unconventional nature. 3 isolated souls finding connection through shared care and understanding. Emma woke the following morning to discover she had slept through dawn in Marcus's room, and her blood turned to ice water when she found both Adrian and Marcus collapsed in their chairs, barely conscious and unnaturally pale, even by their usual standards. She reached for her phone to call emergency services, but Mrs. Corvina appeared instantly to stop her, explaining with urgent whispers that both father and son suffered from severe photosensitivity that required specialized medical attention from doctors who understood their unique conditions. The older woman quickly drew the heavy curtains tighter and ushered Emma toward the door, promising that their private physicians were already on the way and that exposure to even indirect sunlight could prove fatal to both patients. Emma left the estate that morning with her mind reeling from questions she couldn't ask and answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear, carrying with her the image of Marcus's unconscious face turned toward the window, where thin streams of morning light had begun to penetrate the blackout curtains. His skin already showing signs of some reaction, she had never seen in any medical textbook, as if the very touch of dawn was poison to his system. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Emma returned to the Drackle estate that evening, with her mind churning through every strange detail she had witnessed over the past weeks, determined to demand answers about the daylight incident and the growing list of impossibilities that surrounded Marcus and his father. She found Adrian waiting in the main library, his pale features drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like resignation, as if he had been expecting this confrontation and had finally accepted its inevitability. The formal sitting room felt different in the lamplight, shadows deeper and more alive, and Emma noticed for the first time that none of the ornate mirrors scattered throughout the house actually reflected anything at all, their surfaces dark and empty as black water. Adrian gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, crossing her arms and meeting his ancient eyes with determination that surprised them both with its intensity. "I know something is wrong here," she said without preamble, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "Marcus has no reflection. You both collapse at sunrise. Mrs. Corvina talks about protection and ancestral traditions, like they mean something more than family customs. Your son needs help, but not the kind any normal doctor could provide, and I think you know exactly what I am talking about." Adrian studied her face for long moments, weighing something behind his dark eyes, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries Emma was only beginning to understand. "You are correct, Miss Chen. Nothing about this situation is normal, and perhaps it is time you learned the truth about what Marcus truly is, what I am, and why your presence here was never the coincidence you believed it to be." He rose from his chair with fluid grace that seemed to defy normal human movement, and before Emma could blink he had crossed the room to stand beside her, close enough that she should have heard him breathing, but detected only stillness, where his chest should rise and fall. Adrian smiled, and Emma saw fangs extend from his canine teeth, sharp and gleaming in the lamplight, transforming his aristocratic features into something beautiful and terrible and utterly inhuman. His eyes began to glow with their own internal light, pale fire that seemed to burn without heat, and when he moved again it was with speed that made her previous glimpse of his reflexes seem slow and clumsy by comparison. He appeared across the room instantaneously, then back beside her, then lifting a massive oak table with one hand, as if it weighed nothing at all, before setting it down without disturbing the crystal glasses arranged on its surface. "I am Adrian Drackle," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through her bones. "And I have walked this earth for 800 years, as what your kind calls vampire. Marcus is my son, born of my union with a mortal woman named Isabel, who possessed gifts similar to your own. Gifts that allow certain humans to bridge the gap between our worlds and survive contact with supernatural forces that would destroy normal minds." Emma felt her knees weaken, but forced herself to remain standing, her psychology training kicking in to help her process information that should have sent her fleeing in terror, but instead filled her with a strange sense of pieces finally clicking into place. "That explains the dietary restrictions," she said, her voice surprisingly calm, "and the nocturnal schedule and why Marcus seems to sense my emotions so clearly." Adrian nodded, something like relief crossing his features at her pragmatic response. "Marcus is caught between two worlds, neither fully human nor fully vampire, and his trauma has blocked the supernatural abilities that should have manifested years ago. He needs blood to complete his transition and gain full access to his heritage, but he has been refusing all sustenance except what Mrs. Corvina manages to disguise in other foods, making him weaker each day." Emma absorbed this information with the same clinical detachment she brought to studying case files, her mind already working through implications and potential solutions rather than dwelling on the impossibility of the situation. "What does he need from me?" she asked, and Adrian's expression shifted to something that might have been wonder. Most humans who learn our nature either flee in terror or become obsessed with the power they think we represent. But you ask practical questions about how to help a child in need. This is why my subconscious was drawn to protect you, why you resemble my late wife so closely that Mrs. Corvina gasped when she first saw your photograph. There are bloodlines among humans that produce natural bridges between our worlds, and you carry those genetic markers that make you capable of understanding and accepting what Marcus truly is. The sound of alarms suddenly pierced the evening air, sharp electronic wails that seemed to come from every direction at once, and Adrian's face went rigid with an expression Emma had never seen before, something beyond fear and approaching desperation. "They have found us," he said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "The council has come for Marcus, and our time has run out." Heavy footsteps echoed through the corridors outside the library, accompanied by voices speaking in languages Emma couldn't identify but somehow understood carried ancient authority and barely contained violence. Adrian moved to place himself between Emma and the door, his entire body tensing, as if preparing for battle. But before he could speak further, the library doors burst open to admit three figures whose presence seemed to suck warmth and light from the room itself. The first was tall and elegant in the way of old European nobility, with silver hair and eyes like chips of winter ice, his pale skin stretched tight over sharp bones that suggested aristocratic breeding and centuries of absolute power. The second appeared younger, but carried herself with predatory grace that made Emma's instincts scream warnings. Dark hair framing features that were beautiful in the way of poisoned flowers, lovely and deadly in equal measure. The third seemed older than the others combined, his face lined with what might have been wisdom or might have been cruelty accumulated over millennia. Dressed in robes that belonged to no modern era but carried weight of tradition that needed no explanation. "Vladislav, Elena, Magnus," Adrian said, his voice carefully neutral despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. "I was not expecting the council so soon." Vladislav smiled with cold amusement that never reached his pale eyes. "You have become predictable in your weakness, Adrian. First the mortal woman who bore your heir. Now this new attachment who threatens everything our kind has built over centuries of careful separation from human contamination." Elena stepped closer to Emma with movements that suggested hunting and stalking, her dark eyes cataloging every detail of Emma's appearance with obvious disdain. "So this is the human who has captured our king's attention," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made Emma's teeth ache. "She bears remarkable resemblance to the previous mortal who caused such disruption to vampire society. How convenient that Adrian's tastes remain so predictable and so foolish." Magnus spoke for the first time, his voice ancient and filled with regret that seemed genuine despite the threat implicit in his presence. "The council has monitored your behavior for months, Adrian, and we have determined that your emotional compromise makes you unfit to rule the Eastern Coven. Marcus will be removed to our stronghold for proper vampire education, and this human's memories will be cleansed to prevent further contamination of our security." Emma felt ice water replace the blood in her veins as she realized the full scope of the danger facing Marcus. But instead of the terror she expected, she found herself filled with protective fury that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. "You cannot take him," she said, stepping forward despite Adrian's restraining hand on her shoulder. "Marcus is making progress for the first time in 3 years, and removing him from everything familiar will destroy what healing we have accomplished." Elena laughed, the sound like breaking glass mixed with mockery. "The human presumes to dictate terms to the vampire council, how refreshingly naive. Your attachment to the boy is touching but irrelevant, mortal." Decisions about vampire offspring are not made by temporary caregivers who understand nothing of our true nature. Emma looked directly at Marcus, who had appeared silently in the doorway during the confrontation, his pale eyes wide with understanding that went far beyond his apparent years. She knelt to his level and held out her hand, speaking in the gentle voice that had become natural when addressing him. Marcus, these people want to take you away from your father and from our reading sessions. I know you can understand what is happening, and I need you to know that I will never abandon you, no matter what they threaten. The boy moved toward her with careful steps, his gaze never leaving her face, and when he reached her side, he took her outstretched hand in both of his cold ones. Emma stays, he said clearly, his young voice carrying absolute certainty that silenced every other conversation in the room. The council members exchanged meaningful glances that spoke of communication Emma couldn't detect, and Vladislav's expression hardened into something approaching outright hostility. The child speaks at last, but his words only prove how thoroughly he has been corrupted by human sentiment. This attachment will be severed before it can cause further damage to his development. Magnus stepped forward with obvious reluctance, his ancient features creased with what might have been genuine sorrow. Adrian, you have 72 hours to make your choice. Surrender your crown and submit to council authority, allowing us to properly educate Marcus and cleanse this human's memories, or watch us take more direct action to protect vampire society from the chaos your emotional compromises threaten to unleash. The price of continued defiance will be the permanent removal of everything you claim to love, and this time there will be no appeals to ancient laws or bloodline privileges that might offer protection. Emma felt Adrian's hand tighten on her shoulder, and saw something shift in his expression, ancient power rising to meet the council's threat with force that made the air itself seem to thicken with potential violence. But before he could respond, Magnus raised his hand in a gesture that carried finality beyond argument. 3 days, Adrian. Use them wisely, for they may be the last your son spends in your care. The 3 council members departed as suddenly as they had arrived, leaving behind only the lingering scent of old blood and older power. And Emma found herself alone with Adrian and Marcus in a library that now felt more like a war room than a place of quiet learning. Adrian turned to Emma with eyes that held centuries of pain and desperate hope in equal measure. They will return in 3 days to destroy everything I have tried to build, he said quietly. And I fear that this time, even my love for my son may not be enough to save him from the fate they have planned. Emma looked between father and son, seeing the fear they both tried to hide and the deep connection that bound them together, despite the trauma that had driven Marcus into silence, and made a decision that would change everything about the life she had thought she understood. Then we have 3 days to prove them wrong, she said with determination that surprised them all. Tell me everything I need to know about vampire politics and ancient laws, because I am not going anywhere, and Marcus is not going to face this alone. The following evening, Adrian led Emma through corridors of the estate she had never seen before, past hidden doors and down stone steps that seemed to descend far deeper than the mansion's foundation should have allowed, into chambers that spoke of centuries rather than decades, and purposes that went far beyond normal human domesticity. He began her education in vampire society with the kind of clinical precision she had once applied to psychological case studies, explaining power structures and political alliances that stretched back to the fall of empires, whose names she recognized only from history books. Adrian was not simply a powerful vampire, but the last surviving member of a bloodline that had maintained balance between supernatural and human worlds for over a millennium, serving as a bridge between species that would otherwise tear each other apart in their fear and misunderstanding. His death or abdication would leave a power vacuum that other vampire lords would fight to fill, potentially exposing their existence to human authorities who were not prepared to accept the reality of supernatural citizens living among them. Emma learned that Marcus's mixed heritage made him both precious and dangerous to vampire society, a unique bridge between worlds that could either unite the species or destroy the careful separation that had kept both sides safe for centuries. The council feared that Adrian's emotional attachments made him vulnerable to human manipulation, and they pointed to Isabel's death as proof that loving mortals led inevitably to weakness and exposure that threatened all vampire kind. But Emma had spent years studying trauma and healing, and she recognized that Adrian's capacity for love was not weakness, but the very strength that made him effective as a leader who could understand both human and vampire needs. She suggested a third option that surprised Adrian with its bold simplicity. Instead of surrendering or fighting, they would prove that Marcus was thriving under current care by demonstrating his progress to the council in ways they could not dismiss or ignore. Mrs. Corvina appeared in the underground chambers, carrying weapons that looked like they belonged in museums, but felt deadly and immediate in the lamplight. And Emma learned that the stern housekeeper was far more than she appeared to be. A former vampire hunter who had dedicated her life to protecting innocents from supernatural threats. Mrs. Corvina had allied herself with Adrian decades earlier, when she realized that some vampires were trying to coexist peacefully with humanity rather than prey upon it. She began training Emma in supernatural defense techniques, teaching her to recognize and counter vampire abilities, while Adrian worked with Marcus to unlock the supernatural powers that trauma had blocked for 3 years. Emma discovered she possessed rare psychic abilities that allowed her to calm supernatural minds and ease the violent impulses that defined vampire nature, explaining not only her success with Marcus, but also Adrian's inexplicable attraction to her presence. Ancient vampire law included provisions for human keepers who could serve as bridges between worlds. Individuals with psychic gifts strong enough to withstand vampire influence while offering emotional stability that few supernatural beings could achieve alone. The castle's hidden chambers revealed weapons and allies accumulated over centuries, proof that Adrian had been preparing for this confrontation longer than anyone realized, and that his apparent isolation had been strategic rather than accidental. Emma threw herself into training with the same intensity she had once brought to her graduate studies, learning to recognize vampire abilities and counter them with psychic techniques that felt as natural as breathing once she stopped questioning their impossibility. Marcus began practicing with powers he had inherited but never used, discovering he could sense emotions across great distances and influence human minds with gentle suggestion rather than the violent domination typical of full vampires. His mixed heritage allowed him to access vampire strength and speed while retaining human empathy and moral flexibility, making him potentially more powerful than pure vampires who were limited by their predatory instincts. Adrian taught Emma vampire history and political structure while she helped Marcus integrate his dual nature, and for the first time since Isabel's death, the three of them began to function as a true family unit rather than isolated individuals bound together by circumstance and necessity. The evening before the council's deadline, Vladislav appeared alone in Emma's apartment, having bypassed every security system and magical protection as if they were mere suggestions rather than barriers. He sat in her living room with casual elegance that made his presence seem natural despite the impossibility of his arrival, and when Emma returned from visiting her mother in the hospital, she found him reading one of her psychology textbooks with apparent interest. "Your mother's condition has worsened significantly," he said without looking up from the pages, his voice carrying false sympathy that made Emma's skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. "The experimental treatments she needs are extraordinarily expensive and currently beyond your financial reach, despite Adrian's generous compensation for your services." Emma forced herself to remain calm despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her rational mind, recognizing that Vladislav's presence in her private space was both threat and opportunity, depending on how skillfully she could navigate the encounter. "What do you want?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him as if entertaining supernatural visitors was a normal part of her evening routine. Vladislav smiled with predatory satisfaction that revealed fangs sharper and more pronounced than Adrian's, his pale eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that suggested he was reading far more than her surface expressions. "I want to offer you a deal, Miss Chen. Disappear quietly from the Drackle estate, return to your normal life, and your mother's cancer treatments will be fully funded by anonymous benefactors with resources far beyond anything Adrian could provide. All medical expenses, experimental therapies, private nurses, whatever she needs to recover completely." Emma felt her heart skip as she realized the full implications of his offer, understanding that the council had been monitoring her life far longer than she had suspected, and that her mother's illness was being used as leverage in supernatural politics that had nothing to do with human needs or desires. "The price is simply walking away from Marcus and never looking back," Vladislav continued, his voice soft with mock gentleness that fooled no one. "A small sacrifice for a mortal woman to save the life of the person who matters most to her in this world. Refuse this generous offer, and I can guarantee that both your mother and the Drackle family will suffer consequences that extend far beyond anything you have yet imagined." Emma sat across from Vladislav in the estate's formal parlor, her hands folded calmly in her lap, while her mind raced with the implications of his offer. Knowing that every word spoken in this room was being recorded by the hidden surveillance system Adrian had revealed to her the night before. The ancient vampire counselor lounged in his chair with predatory grace, his pale eyes studying her face for any sign of weakness as he outlined the benefits of accepting his proposal to disappear quietly from Marcus's life. "Your mother's cancer treatments would be fully funded," he said with silky persuasion. "The experimental therapy the insurance companies refuse could begin immediately, and you could return to your normal human existence without the burden of supernatural complications that will only grow more dangerous with time." Emma let her expression show carefully calculated consideration, while internally cataloging every detail Vladislav revealed about the council's fears and motivations, understanding that this conversation was as much about gathering intelligence as it was about rejecting his manipulative bargain. She learned that the council's opposition to Adrian stemmed not just from his power, but from his revolutionary vision of vampire-human cooperation, a future that threatened the carefully maintained separation that had protected their kind for millennia. Vladislav's voice carried grudging respect as he described Adrian's influence among younger vampires who increasingly questioned the old isolationist policies, and Emma realized that her presence at the estate represented far more than a threat to one vampire's emotional stability, but a symbol of the changing world the council desperately wanted to prevent. When she pressed him about Isabel's death, Vladislav's composure slipped enough to reveal the truth he had probably never intended to share. Adrian's late wife had been developing a serum that would allow vampires to walk safely in sunlight. He admitted with barely contained fury, a discovery that would have fundamentally altered the balance of power between supernatural and human worlds. "We could not allow such contamination of our nature," he said, the word contamination dripping with centuries of prejudice and fear. "Isabel died because she represented change, because she dared to imagine a future where vampires were not bound by the limitations that had defined their existence since the beginning of recorded history." Emma felt her blood turn to ice as she understood the full scope of what Marcus had witnessed that terrible night. Not just his mother's death, but the deliberate destruction of hope for his own future integration of his dual nature. As Vladislav continued his pitch, Emma made what she knew was a calculated risk, allowing her voice to waver with apparent uncertainty while she gathered more information about the council's structure and decision-making processes. She discovered that their authority rested on ancient laws that had not been challenged in centuries, that their power derived from fear rather than legitimate governance, and that even among the three counselors, significant divisions existed about how to handle Adrian's growing influence. Vladislav clearly commanded Elena's support through some combination of shared ambition and personal history, but Magnus remained uncommitted, bound by duty to uphold vampire law, but increasingly uncomfortable with the council's authoritarian methods. Emma let herself appear to seriously consider his offer while filing away every weakness he inadvertently revealed, every crack in the council's unified facade that might be exploited when the final confrontation arrived. She had learned enough from Adrian about vampire psychology to understand that Vladislav's confidence came from centuries of humans accepting supernatural authority without question, and she intended to use his underestimation of human strategic thinking against him when the moment was right. The meeting ended with Emma requesting time to consider his proposal, playing the role of a frightened young woman overwhelmed by forces beyond her understanding, while internally, she planned how to use everything she had learned against the council's plans. Vladislav left the estate believing he had planted seeds of doubt that would grow into compliance, never suspecting that Emma had been recording every word he spoke for Adrian's later analysis. That evening, as Emma reviewed the surveillance footage with Adrian and Mrs. Corvina, she felt a fierce satisfaction at having turned Vladislav's manipulation tactics back on him, proving to herself that she could think strategically when Marcus's safety depended on her actions. But their sense of victory was short-lived, shattered when Marcus suddenly convulsed in his chair, his small body going rigid as supernatural energies he couldn't control coursed through his developing vampire abilities. Emma rushed to his side instinctively, her hands finding his face as she spoke his name in the gentle voice that had always calmed him before. The moment her skin touched his, the seizure stopped as if a switch had been thrown, his pale eyes focusing on hers with desperate gratitude as his breathing slowly returned to normal. Adrian knelt beside them both, his own hands shaking as he checked Marcus for injuries, and Emma saw terror in the vampire king's eyes that reminded her that beneath his supernatural power lay a father's heart that could be broken by watching his child suffer. The psychic connection between Emma and Marcus had never been more apparent than in that moment, her touch providing an anchor that his overwhelmed nervous system desperately needed to find stability. But even as relief flooded through the room, they all understood that the seizure had been a clear signal that Marcus's vampire abilities were actively developing, a change that would not go unnoticed by the council's surveillance methods. Mrs. Corvina confirmed their fears within the hour, reporting that supernatural monitoring devices throughout the supernatural community had registered the psychic spike generated by Marcus's episode. The council would know by morning that Adrian's son was transitioning into his full vampire heritage, information that would force their hand far sooner than any of them had hoped. With their timeline collapsed from weeks to days, Adrian made the decision to share with Emma the full scope of vampire law and customs that governed their situation, spreading ancient texts across his study table while explaining the legal precedents that might protect Marcus from the council's interference. Emma learned that hybrid children were afforded special protections under codes that predated the current council's authority, but only if they had a recognized human advocate who could speak for their best interests during supernatural legal proceedings. The role was called keeper in the ancient texts, a position that had historically been filled by psychic humans who served vampire nobility as advisors and protectors of vulnerable family members. Adrian's voice grew heavy with emotion as he explained that accepting the keeper bonding ritual would permanently link Emma's psychic abilities to Marcus's well-being, creating a magical connection that would allow her to stabilize his developing powers, but would also bind her to the supernatural world in ways that could never be undone. The ritual itself was unlike anything Emma had ever imagined. Conducted in a hidden chamber beneath the estate where walls carved with protective symbols older than recorded history enclosed a space that hummed with accumulated magical energy. Adrian guided her through the ancient words, while Mrs. Corvina prepared the ceremonial implements, but Emma found herself focusing not on the formal aspects of the ritual, but on the profound sense of rightness that filled her as she formally accepted responsibility for Marcus's welfare. As the magical bonds formed between them, Emma experienced flashes of Adrian's memories, seeing through his eyes the joy of Marcus's birth, the perfection of those early years when Isabel's love had created a sanctuary of happiness within the Gothic walls of the estate. She felt Adrian's devastating grief when vampire politics destroyed that sanctuary, witnessed his desperate attempts to protect Marcus from the trauma that had stolen his voice and his sense of safety in the world. But she also experienced something unexpected: the gradual healing of Adrian's own centuries-old emotional wounds as he watched her gentle care restore his son's connection to life and hope. The bonding ritual revealed truths Emma had never suspected about her own nature, showing her that the empathy she had always considered simply part of her personality was actually a manifestation of psychic abilities that had been unconsciously active throughout her life. Her success with difficult children, her ability to sense emotional needs that others missed, her natural instinct for providing exactly the kind of comfort traumatized souls required, all of it stemmed from gifts that had been passed down through generations of women who had served supernatural families as healers and protectors. The revelation recontextualized her entire life, explaining why she had always felt drawn to cases other therapists considered hopeless, why she could establish connections with children who had shut out the rest of the world. As the ritual reached completion, Emma felt the magical bonds settling into place, like puzzle pieces finding their proper positions, creating a network of psychic connection that linked her not only to Marcus, but also to Adrian in ways that transcended simple emotional attachment. She could sense Marcus's developing vampire abilities as they struggled to integrate with his human consciousness, and she understood that her role as his keeper would involve helping him navigate that integration without losing the essential parts of his humanity that made him who he was. The profound intimacy of sharing Adrian's memories had also created an understanding between them that went beyond words, a recognition that their connection was built on shared purpose and genuine care, rather than the romantic complications that might have developed under different circumstances. But their moment of triumph was cut short when alarms throughout the estate began sounding, signaling that Elena and Magnus had arrived ahead of schedule, with news that changed everything about their situation. The two counselors entered Adrian's study with expressions that mixed urgency with barely contained hostility, and Elena's first words confirmed Emma's worst fears about the consequences of her newly revealed heritage. "We know what she is," Elena announced without preamble, her pale eyes fixed on Emma with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. "The bloodline records show her ancestry clearly now that we know where to look, descendants of the psychic healers who served the old royal houses before the compact banned such alliances. Her very existence represents a violation of laws that have protected our separation from human affairs for 5 centuries." Magnus stepped forward with obvious reluctance, his weathered features showing the strain of enforcing decisions he clearly disagreed with, but his voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he delivered the council's ultimatum. "The hybrid child may live under our protection if his keeper accepts formal bonding with all its restrictions and obligations," he said, each word carefully measured and final. "But if she refuses to submit to our governance, both she and the child represent threats to supernatural security that cannot be permitted to continue." Emma felt the weight of their attention like a physical pressure, as Elena elaborated on what formal keeper status would entail, restrictions that would effectively end her human life, even while preserving her physical existence. She would be magically bound to the estate grounds, aging at a drastically reduced rate, but unable to leave or maintain relationships with humans who might be endangered by knowledge of supernatural affairs. Her mother would be told she had died in an accident, her university career would end, her entire human identity would be erased to protect the secrecy that vampire survival depended upon. The choice they offered was not really a choice at all, Emma realized, but a carefully structured trap designed to force her compliance through emotional blackmail. Yet as she looked at Marcus, still pale and shaken from his earlier seizure, she understood that no other keeper could provide the specific psychic resonance that had brought him back from 3 years of traumatized silence. Adrian offered to release her from any obligation, his voice thick with emotion as he promised to find another way to protect Marcus that would not require her sacrifice. But Emma had already made her decision the moment she felt the bonding ritual settle into place, recognizing that her purpose in life was not to pursue her own dreams, but to serve as a bridge between worlds for those who could not cross those boundaries alone. Her mother, informed of the situation through carefully worded phone conversations, had encouraged Emma to follow her heart regardless of the cost, understanding that her daughter's greatest gift had always been her ability to heal those whom society had given up on as beyond help. Emma's acceptance of formal keeper status was interrupted by new alarms sounding throughout the estate, different in tone and urgency from those that had announced the counselor's arrival. Mrs. Corvina burst into the study with terror written across her pale features, announcing that Vladislav had returned with human allies, vampire hunters, who had agreed to his plan of attacking during the bonding ceremony when all parties would be magically vulnerable and unable to defend themselves effectively. The betrayal represented a violation of supernatural law so profound that even Elena gasped in shock, understanding that Vladislav's alliance with humans threatened the very foundations of vampire society. As they heard the sounds of forced entry echoing through the estate's corridors, Emma realized that the careful political maneuvering and legal precedents they had been relying on meant nothing in the face of Vladislav's willingness to shatter every tradition that had governed vampire behavior for millennia, and that the next few hours would determine not just Marcus's fate, but the future of supernatural human relations for generations to come. The ancient binding ceremony had reached its crescendo when the estate's windows exploded inward in a shower of glass and silver-laced projectiles, as Dr. Harrison Kane led a team of vampire hunters through the Gothic mansion's shattered defenses with military precision that spoke of months of careful planning. Emma watched in horror as her former university advisor, the man who had guided her thesis research and recommended her for countless opportunities, revealed himself as something far more sinister than an academic mentor. Kane's familiar face was twisted with zealous determination as he directed his team through the corridors with intimate knowledge of the estate's layout, proving that Emma's employment here had never been the coincidence she had believed, but part of an elaborate scheme to place a human asset inside vampire society's most protected sanctuary. The hunters moved with coordinated efficiency that suggested extensive training in supernatural combat, their weapons gleaming with silver coating and strange technological modifications that hummed with electromagnetic energy designed to disrupt vampire abilities. Kane himself wore body armor, etched with symbols that made Emma's newly awakened psychic senses recoil in pain. Protective wards that had been specifically crafted to shield humans from the mental influence that vampires relied upon in combat situations. His voice carried across the estate's great hall with triumphant satisfaction as he called out instructions to his team, directing them to secure the hybrid child while eliminating any vampires who resisted their mission. Emma felt the incomplete bonding ceremony torn apart as magical energies scattered like broken glass throughout the sacred chamber, leaving her caught between human and supernatural states with abilities she barely understood and couldn't fully control. Adrian moved with centuries of combat experience, his movements flowing like deadly water as he engaged multiple hunters simultaneously while trying to reach Marcus's position in the upper floors of the estate. But even his supernatural speed and strength were challenged by weapons designed specifically to counter vampire advantages, silver-tipped projectiles that could wound him grievously, and electromagnetic fields that disrupted his enhanced reflexes. Mrs. Corvina fought beside him with skills that revealed her former life as a vampire hunter herself, her knowledge of their tactics and equipment proving invaluable as she directed Adrian away from the most dangerous traps Kane's team had prepared throughout their infiltration route. Elena and Magnus found themselves forced into an alliance with their former adversary as the immediate threat of human discovery trumped their political differences. Ancient vampire law demanding that all supernatural beings unite against external threats to their continued existence. But the hunters had come prepared for vampire resistance. Their technology specifically designed to neutralize the speed and strength advantages that had protected vampire society for millennia. Emma realized with sickening clarity that Cain had been manipulating her from the very beginning, using her genuine concern for Marcus to gather intelligence about the estate's defenses and the family's routines. Her mother's cancer treatments, she now understood, had been funded by Cain's organization as leverage to ensure her compliance when the time came for this assault. Every conversation about her work, every casual question about the Drackle family's habits, had been part of a comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation designed to make tonight's attack possible. Cain's ultimate goal became clear as he cornered Emma in the ceremonial chamber, his familiar professorial voice explaining his organization's mission with the same tone he had once used to discuss psychological theories in university classrooms. They wanted to weaponize vampire abilities through hybrid children like Marcus, using their unique physiology to create a serum that would give humans supernatural powers without the traditional weaknesses that vampires carried. Marcus represented the key to their research, a living bridge between species whose blood contained genetic information that could revolutionize their understanding of supernatural biology. Cain revealed that his hunters had been studying vampire-human hybrids for decades, but Marcus was the first they had discovered with the perfect genetic balance necessary for their experimental protocols. Emma felt her world collapse as she understood the full scope of the betrayal, realizing that everyone she had trusted outside the supernatural community had been working toward this moment, when Marcus would become a laboratory specimen in service of human ambition. The choice Cain offered her was stark in its simplicity: complete her transformation into a full keeper, gaining the magical protection that would save Marcus, but requiring hours of vulnerable ceremony that they simply did not have, or remain human and retain the mobility to fight beside Adrian with abilities she was only beginning to understand. The incomplete bonding had left Emma in a liminal state where her psychic powers were stronger than ever before, but unstable, capable of incredible feats, but likely to burn out her human nervous system if pushed beyond carefully measured limits. She could feel Marcus's terror through their partially formed connection, his young mind crying out for help as hunters secured him with restraints designed to contain supernatural strength. Adrian's anguish bled through their shared bond as he realized his son was being taken despite all his careful preparations and centuries of accumulated power. Emma made her choice in the space between heartbeats, understanding that Marcus needed her mobile and fighting rather than safely transformed and helpless to intervene in his immediate danger. She abandoned the ceremonial chamber and threw herself into the battle raging throughout the estate, her untrained but incredibly powerful psychic abilities manifesting in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. Emma discovered she could disrupt the hunters' technological advantages by flooding their electromagnetic weapons with psychic energy that overloaded their carefully calibrated systems. Her empathic abilities, enhanced by the partial bonding ceremony, allowed her to sense the hunters' tactical plans before they could implement them, giving Adrian and his allies crucial intelligence about incoming attacks and strategic positioning. But despite their unified resistance, the sheer number of hunters and their technological superiority proved overwhelming, and Emma watched in horror as Marcus was carried from the estate in specially designed containment equipment that neutralized his developing vampire abilities. Cain's victory speech as he departed with his prize made Emma's blood freeze with its casual cruelty. His promise to torture Marcus until the child provided the biological samples necessary for their research delivered with the same academic detachment he had once applied to discussing psychological case studies. The abandoned estate felt hollow and violated after the hunter's departure, its sacred spaces desecrated by violence and its protective wards shattered beyond immediate repair. Adrian knelt in the wreckage of his son's room, his shoulders shaking with grief that Emma felt echoing through their incomplete bond, while Elena and Magnus worked with Mrs. Corvina to treat wounds that would heal with supernatural speed but left emotional scars that might never fade. Emma realized that their only hope lay in immediate pursuit, using the psychic connection that still linked her to Marcus to track the hunters to whatever facility they had prepared for their horrific experiments. The rescue mission that followed tested every skill Emma had developed and several she discovered only under extreme pressure, as she and Adrian infiltrated Kane's research facility with the desperate urgency of parents fighting to save their child. Emma's psychic abilities proved crucial in bypassing the facility's supernatural detection systems, her human nature allowing her to approach undetected, while her enhanced empathic senses mapped the building's layout through the emotional signatures of everyone inside. Adrian's centuries of combat experience guided their tactical approach, his vampire abilities perfectly complemented by Emma's psychic support in ways that created a partnership more effective than either could have achieved alone. They found Marcus strapped to a medical table in a sterile laboratory that reminded Emma of horror movies, his small body connected to monitoring equipment that tracked every biological function while extractors prepared to harvest blood samples for analysis. The child's eyes found Emma's the moment she entered the room, and the relief that flooded through their psychic connection gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Marcus had been using his developing vampire abilities to resist Kane's experiments, his young mind instinctively fighting against the intrusion with supernatural defenses that were slowly killing him through exhaustion and psychic feedback. Emma realized that completing her keeper transformation would allow her to share Marcus's supernatural resilience, potentially saving his life by providing the psychic anchor he desperately needed to stabilize his overwhelmed nervous system. Adrian offered his own life in exchange for Marcus's freedom when Kane arrived with reinforcements to stop their rescue attempt, his willingness to sacrifice himself proving that he had learned to value others above the power that had defined his existence for centuries. But Emma refused to accept any solution that required losing someone she loved, her determination to save everyone sparking innovations in her psychic abilities that surprised even the ancient vampires who thought they understood the limits of human potential. The battle that erupted in Kane's laboratory pushed all of them beyond their known capabilities. Emma's empathic powers, allowing her to coordinate Adrian's attacks, while simultaneously providing psychic interference that disrupted the hunter's weapon systems. Marcus, inspired by Emma's courage and his father's protective fury, began speaking for the first time in complete sentences, his young voice calling out tactical information that proved crucial to their escape attempts. But Kane had prepared for vampire rescue attempts, activating a supernatural containment field that trapped all vampires within the facility while allowing his human hunters complete freedom of movement. The energy barrier that surrounded the building was specifically designed to prevent supernatural beings from phasing through walls or using enhanced speed to escape, creating a prison that even Adrian's centuries of experience could not overcome through conventional means. Emma realized she was their only hope precisely because her incomplete transformation had left her technically human despite her enhanced abilities, allowing her to move freely, while her vampire family remained trapped by Kane's technological marvel. Under the extreme stress of watching Marcus suffer and Adrian struggle helplessly against constraints designed by someone who understood vampire weaknesses better than they knew themselves, Emma's psychic abilities underwent a catastrophic evolution that revealed the true purpose of her bloodline. The power that flooded through her nervous system was unlike anything she had experienced before, not just the ability to calm supernatural minds, but to actively reshape magical energy itself. She discovered she could disrupt the containment field by flooding it with psychic resonance that overloaded its supernatural detection systems, while simultaneously enhancing Adrian's abilities beyond their normal limits by serving as a psychic amplifier for his vampire powers. Marcus drew strength from her psychic support and began accessing vampire abilities that even Adrian hadn't known were possible, his hybrid nature allowing him to channel both human creativity and supernatural power in combinations that defied traditional understanding of either species' limitations. The child who had been silent for 3 years found his voice not just in words, but in psychic communication that linked all three of them in a network of shared consciousness more intimate than any family bond Emma had ever imagined possible. Kane's facility became a battleground where the old rules of supernatural human conflict were rewritten by a family that refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose upon them. Emma's discovery that her bloodline had been specifically bred centuries ago to produce perfect keeper partners for vampire royalty explained not just her unusual abilities, but the inevitable pull she had felt toward Marcus from their first meeting. Her psychic evolution was designed to respond to her vampire family's needs, creating new capabilities as circumstances demanded them, turning Kane's experiments into the catalyst for awakening powers that had been dormant in her genetic code. Marcus saved Emma from a hunter's attack by instinctively using vampire speed to intercept a silver-tipped projectile aimed at her heart. His protective instincts proving that the family bonds between them had transformed three isolated individuals into a unified force stronger than the sum of their individual capabilities. Their escape from Kane's facility was coordinated with precision that spoke of perfect trust and understanding, Emma's psychic abilities guiding them past technological barriers, while Adrian's combat skills cleared physical obstacles, and Marcus's hybrid nature allowed him to interface with both human technology and supernatural defenses. But their victory was incomplete, as Kane's final act of spite was to broadcast recorded footage of their supernatural abilities to news networks around the world, threatening to expose vampire society unless Adrian surrendered his kingdom and submitted to human authority. The revelation that vampires existed among humans sent shockwaves through both communities as centuries of carefully maintained secrecy crumbled under the weight of undeniable video evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away through conventional means. The full Vampire Council convened in the estate's ancient chamber beneath the Gothic mansion, their combined presence filling the stone-carved space with power that made the air itself seem thick and oppressive, while emergency torches cast flickering shadows across walls that had witnessed centuries of supernatural justice. Emma stood beside Adrian and Marcus in the center of the circular room, feeling the weight of dozens of ancient eyes upon them as vampire lords and ladies from across the world gathered to determine whether the Eastern Coven's progressive leadership represented evolution or catastrophe for their kind. Kane's broadcast had sent shockwaves through both human and supernatural communities, forcing vampire society into the light they had spent millennia avoiding, and the Council's decision about Adrian's fitness to rule would determine whether this exposure led to war or cooperation between species. Magnus took his place as chief adjudicator with obvious reluctance, his weathered features showing the strain of presiding over a trial that could reshape supernatural society forever, while Elena and Vladislav flanked him at the ceremonial table with expressions that revealed nothing about their internal allegiances or political calculations. Emma felt her partially completed keeper transformation humming through her nervous system as she prepared to defend not just her own worthiness, but the entire concept of vampire-human cooperation that her presence represented. The formal accusations against Adrian rang through the chamber with centuries of accumulated authority, charges of emotional compromise and reckless endangerment that threatened everything vampire society had built through careful isolation from human affairs. Vladislav's betrayal had ironically strengthened Adrian's position by proving that traditional isolationist policies were failing to protect vampire interests, his alliance with human hunters representing exactly the kind of exposure and vulnerability the Council had always claimed to prevent. Magnus revealed during his opening statements that the council had been secretly divided about human-vampire relations for decades, with progressive factions gaining influence among younger vampires who questioned the sustainability of absolute separation in an increasingly connected world. Elena surprised everyone by stepping forward to testify on Adrian's behalf, her voice carrying emotional weight as she admitted that she had secretly supported his progressive views for centuries, but had feared the political consequences of opposing Vladislav's isolationist agenda. The revelation that even conservative council members had harbored doubts about traditional policies shifted the entire tone of the proceedings, transforming what should have been Adrian's trial into a broader examination of vampire society's future direction. Emma's turn to testify brought her face to face with centuries of vampire prejudice and fear, ancient beings who had survived by viewing humans as either prey or threat, struggling to accept the possibility of genuine partnership between species. Her partially awakened keeper abilities manifested involuntarily under their scrutiny, psychic energy radiating from her in waves that calmed the supernatural tensions crackling through the chamber like electrical storms. The demonstration of her natural ability to ease vampire aggression and promote rational discourse proved more effective than any verbal argument about the benefits of human-vampire cooperation. Marcus's testimony became the trial's turning point, his young voice carrying across the stone chamber as he spoke publicly for the first time since witnessing his mother's death 3 years earlier. His words, carefully chosen but delivered with genuine emotion, described his healing journey and the ways Emma's presence had restored his connection to both his vampire and human heritage. The child who had been silent for so long proved through his articulate testimony that hybrid children represented evolution rather than contamination, their unique perspective offering insights that neither purely human nor purely vampire minds could achieve alone. Emma watched with pride as Marcus explained how her reading sessions had helped him process trauma while awakening supernatural abilities he had been too frightened to explore. His courage in facing the assembled council proving that he had inherited his father's leadership qualities along with his mother's empathic gifts. The formal vote that followed revealed divisions within vampire society that went far deeper than anyone had suspected, with progressive council members emerging from centuries of careful silence to support Adrian's vision of measured integration with human civilization. But the split decision that resulted satisfied no one completely, Adrian retaining his crown by the narrowest possible margin, while Emma and Marcus faced the requirement to prove their bond through a final trial that would either validate their partnership or destroy them both. The complete keeper transformation ritual that served as their final test was unlike anything recorded in vampire law for over 5 centuries, requiring Emma to undergo magical bonding while Marcus experienced his full vampire transition simultaneously, their psychic connection serving as anchor for both dangerous processes. The ancient chamber was cleared of all observers except Adrian, Magnus, and Mrs. Corvina, the magical energies involved in dual transformation considered too volatile for larger audiences to witness safely. Emma felt her human nervous system stretching to accommodate psychic abilities that expanded exponentially as the ritual progressed, her consciousness broadening to encompass not just Marcus's emotional state, but the complex web of supernatural energies that flowed through vampire society like an invisible circulatory system. Marcus's vampire transition was gentler than traditional awakenings because of Emma's psychic support, her presence allowing him to access supernatural abilities without losing the essential humanity that made him unique among hybrid children. Adrian could only watch helplessly as both people he loved most faced potential death, his centuries of accumulated power useless to protect them during a process that required their individual strength and mutual trust to survive. The transformation revealed deeper truths about Emma and Marcus's bond that even they had not fully understood, her role extending far beyond calming his autism-related sensitivities to actually helping him integrate his dual nature into a coherent sense of self. Emma's emergence from the complete ritual brought with it enhanced psychic abilities that made her previous talents seem pale by comparison, along with the extended lifespan and magical protection that would allow her to serve as Marcus's keeper for centuries to come. But she retained her human empathy and emotional flexibility, the qualities that made her effective in bridging supernatural and human perspectives, remaining intact despite her magical enhancement. Marcus successfully completed his vampire transition while maintaining the essential humanity that Emma's influence had nurtured, becoming the first recorded case of a peaceful hybrid who could access supernatural abilities without losing empathic connection to human experience. The child who had emerged from this process was neither fully human nor fully vampire, but something entirely new. A bridge between worlds that offered hope for future cooperation between species that had been enemies for millennia. Adrian's realization during the transformation ceremony fundamentally changed his understanding of leadership and power, recognizing that his greatest strength had never been his isolation or supernatural abilities, but his capacity to love and inspire loyalty in those who chose to follow him. Emma's discovery that becoming a keeper amplified, rather than diminished her natural gifts, validated her decision to sacrifice her human life for the greater purpose of healing and protecting those who existed between worlds. But their moment of triumph was shattered when alarms throughout the estate announced that Cain had escaped from supernatural custody and was launching a final assault on the Gothic mansion with backup forces recruited from human military units sympathetic to his anti-vampire agenda. The escaped researcher's determination to destroy what he saw as an abomination of natural order brought together an alliance of human soldiers and rogue vampire hunters, whose combined forces represented the greatest threat Adrian's rule had ever faced. Emma's newly enhanced abilities were immediately tested as she found herself coordinating the estate's defense using psychic powers she barely understood, her consciousness expanding to encompass the tactical situation across multiple floors of the mansion simultaneously. Marcus proved that his hybrid nature made him uniquely suited to bridge human and vampire combat strategies. His ability to think like both species, allowing him to anticipate attacks that would have surprised purely supernatural defenders. The battle that raged through the Gothic corridors brought together vampire nobility, fighting alongside reformed hunters like Mrs. Corvina, while human authorities who had learned the truth about supernatural citizens chose cooperation over conflict in the face of Cain's extremist agenda. Emma discovered that her enhanced psychic abilities allowed her to disrupt military equipment while simultaneously providing tactical intelligence to vampire defenders, her consciousness serving as a communications network that coordinated supernatural abilities with human strategic thinking. Marcus's courage during the final confrontation with Cain proved that the frightened child who had hidden in traumatic silence had grown into a young leader capable of protecting those he loved, his development from victim to protector completing the healing journey that Emma's presence had begun. The defeat of Cain's forces led to unprecedented cooperation between human governments and vampire society, resulting in the formation of a joint supernatural human council with Adrian and Emma serving as founding members who could speak for both communities. Emma's mother experienced a miraculous recovery from her cancer, the disease mysteriously disappearing after exposure to Emma's enhanced healing abilities during a carefully orchestrated visit that proved keeper powers extended beyond supernatural applications. Marcus enrolled in a special school designed for supernatural children struggling with their dual natures, but continued his human education as well, his integrated approach to learning serving as a model for other hybrid children who followed his example. The unconventional family structure that emerged from their trials was defined not by romantic relationships, but by shared purpose and mutual protection. Emma, becoming Marcus's official guardian while serving as Adrian's partner in the leadership responsibilities that shaped vampire society's future. The story's resolution came not through traditional romantic conclusions, but through the establishment of a new model for supernatural human cooperation that honored both species' needs while protecting the vulnerable individuals who existed between worlds. 6 months after Cain's defeat, Emma found herself reading to a new group of supernatural children in the estate's converted library, her voice finding the same gentle rhythm that had first reached Marcus during his darkest period of traumatic silence. Marcus assisted her with these sessions, using his own experience of healing and integration to help other hybrid children navigate the challenges of existing between human and vampire worlds. His development, from silent victim to confident helper, represented the kind of transformation that Emma's keeper abilities were designed to facilitate, proving that love and patience could overcome even the deepest supernatural trauma. Adrian watched these sessions from the doorway, as he had during Emma's first weeks at the estate, but his expression now carried hope instead of desperate longing, understanding that his son had not only survived his dual heritage, but was learning to use it in service of others who faced similar struggles. The Gothic mansion that had once felt like a prison of isolation and grief had been transformed into a sanctuary where supernatural families could find healing and support, Emma's presence having changed not just Marcus's life, but the entire culture of vampire society. The reading sessions that had begun as experimental therapy had evolved into a formal program that attracted supernatural children from around the world, their parents recognizing that Emma's unique combination of human empathy and enhanced psychic abilities offered hope for integration that traditional vampire education could not provide. Marcus's role as assistant teacher proved that hybrid children could serve as bridges between communities rather than threats to supernatural secrecy. His bilingual fluency in both human and vampire cultural understanding, making him an invaluable resource for families struggling with similar challenges. Emma's enhanced abilities continued to evolve in response to her work with traumatized supernatural children, her psychic gifts adapting to each individual's specific needs while maintaining the essential gentleness that had first reached Marcus during his period of selective mutism. The partnership between Adrian and Emma in both family and political contexts demonstrated that vampire-human cooperation could strengthen rather than weaken supernatural society, their different perspectives combining to create solutions that neither species could have developed alone. The final scene found the three of them gathered in Marcus's room for their evening reading session, a tradition that had survived political upheaval and supernatural transformation to remain the anchor of their family bond. Emma's voice carried the same soothing quality that had first broken through Marcus's traumatic silence, while his responses showed the confidence and emotional growth that 3 years of patient healing had accomplished. Adrian's presence in the doorway symbolized the protective love that had motivated every decision he had made since becoming a father, his understanding of family having evolved from desperate isolation to confident partnership with the humans who had chosen to share his supernatural world. 1 year had passed since Cain's defeat, and the establishment of the Supernatural Human Council, and Emma walked through the transformed corridors of the Dracul estate with a sense of wonder at how completely the Gothic mansion had been reimagined as a place of learning and healing rather than isolation and secrets. The heavy blackout curtains had been replaced with specially treated glass that filtered sunlight to safe levels for vampire children, while still allowing natural light to fill rooms that had known only lamplight for centuries. And the portraits of stern ancestors had given way to artwork created by the supernatural children who now called this place their second home. Marcus walked beside her as they made their morning rounds through classrooms where human and vampire children learned together under the guidance of teachers trained in both conventional education and supernatural psychology. His confident stride and easy conversation marking the incredible journey from traumatized silence to articulate leadership that had defined his growth over the past year. At 13, he had grown tall and lean, his pale features showing the aristocratic bones inherited from his father, while his expressions carried the warmth and empathy that Emma's influence had nurtured throughout their partnership. The school they had built together represented everything Emma had dreamed of during her graduate studies in child psychology, a place where differences were celebrated rather than pathologized, and where children who had felt isolated by abilities others feared could find community with peers who understood their unique challenges. Marcus served as peer mentor to newly arrived students, his own experience of integration between human and vampire natures making him uniquely qualified to help other hybrid children navigate the complexities of dual heritage without losing essential parts of themselves in the process. Emma had written a book about their experience during the long summer months when the school was closed to new admissions, disguising their true story as fantasy fiction that nonetheless provided practical guidance for families struggling with supernatural complications they couldn't discuss openly with conventional therapists or educators. The book had found its way to families across the world through carefully maintained networks of supernatural communities, offering hope and concrete strategies for parents who had believed their children were beyond help. Her mother visited regularly now, having embraced her role as unofficial grandmother to Marcus with the same fierce protectiveness she had once directed toward Emma's own childhood struggles, and her recovery from cancer had been so complete that she served as living proof of the healing potential that emerged when human and supernatural communities worked in partnership rather than opposition. The evening reading sessions that had begun as experimental therapy for one traumatized child had evolved into a beloved tradition that anchored each day's learning activities, with Emma gathering children from both worlds in the estate's great library to share stories that helped them process their experiences and imagine futures where their differences became sources of strength rather than shame. Marcus often assisted with these sessions, his clear young voice picking up narratives when Emma paused to address individual children's questions or concerns, his natural teaching ability proving that his healing journey had equipped him to guide others facing similar challenges. Adrian had transformed vampire governance through laws that protected hybrid children and formally recognized keeper partnerships, establishing precedents that ensured future generations would not face the isolation and persecution that had defined supernatural society for centuries. His relationship with Emma had evolved beyond traditional categories into something that honored both their individual strengths and their shared commitment to building bridges between communities that had been enemies for too long. They were partners in leadership who brought different perspectives to every decision, co-parents to Marcus, whose love had created the foundation for everything else they had accomplished, and deeply connected souls who had discovered that their purpose lay in healing divisions that others had accepted as permanent features of the supernatural landscape. Adrian's presence at the evening reading sessions spoke to how completely his understanding of strength and leadership had changed. The vampire king who had once ruled through isolation and fear, now finding his greatest power in the gentle authority that came from fostering growth and healing in the children who would inherit the world he was working to improve. Marcus had grown into a confident young man whose regular speech and easy social interactions would have seemed impossible during those first months of traumatic silence. His ability to help other autistic children understand their gifts as enhanced perception, rather than limiting differences, marking the completion of his own journey from victim to healer. His dual nature allowed him to serve as interpreter between human emotional complexity and vampire instinctual clarity, making him an ideal bridge between communities that had struggled to understand each other's motivations and needs. The children who gathered for evening story time represented the future that Emma and Adrian were working to create, human and vampire students, whose friendships crossed species lines with the natural ease of childhood, unencumbered by centuries of accumulated prejudice and fear. Emma's voice still carried the same gentle cadence that had first reached Marcus during his darkest period, but now it addressed a circle of faces that reflected every variation of supernatural heritage and human background, all united by their shared experience of being different in ways that required understanding rather than correction. The stories she chose increasingly came from their own experiences rather than published books. Tales of children who had learned to embrace abilities that others feared and families who had chosen love over prejudice when faced with circumstances that challenged everything they thought they understood about the world. As evening settled over the estate and the last rays of filtered sunlight faded from the library windows, Emma found herself growing drowsy in the comfortable chair that had become as familiar as her own bed, the rhythm of her own reading voice combining with the day's accumulated exhaustion to pull her toward the kind of peaceful sleep she had never experienced before, finding her place in this unconventional family. Marcus noticed her eyelids growing heavy and smoothly took over the narrative without missing a beat, his confident voice carrying the story forward, while Adrian moved quietly around the library, dimming gas lamps to the soft glow that best suited vampire children's enhanced night vision. The three of them had created something entirely new in the supernatural world, a family bound not by blood or ancient law, but by conscious choice and shared commitment to healing and growth. Their love expressed through daily acts of protection and nurturing that transformed individual trauma into collective strength. Marcus's voice carried clearly through the lamp-lit library as he continued the evening's story, his words weaving between fantasy and reality in ways that helped his young audience process their own experiences of existing between worlds that often seemed incompatible. Emma stirred in her chair as consciousness returned gradually, her psychic abilities automatically monitoring the emotional atmosphere of the room and finding only the contentment and security that marked successful healing from the trauma that had brought most of these children to their program. The story Marcus was telling drew from their own journey, a tale of a young prince who had lost his voice, but found it again through the patient love of a teacher who saw his silence as protection rather than defiance, and a father who learned that true strength came from vulnerability rather than isolation. Adrian watched from his position beside the library's tall windows, his expression holding the wonder of someone who had lived for centuries without believing that happiness was possible for those who carried supernatural burdens, his love for Emma and Marcus visible in every protective gesture and gentle smile. The letter that arrived the following morning brought news of another supernatural family in crisis, a young werewolf pack whose children were struggling with transformations that traditional pack wisdom couldn't address. And Emma felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had guided every major decision since she first answered the mysterious job posting that had brought her into Marcus's life. Marcus read the letter over her shoulder with the kind of calm competence that would have seemed impossible during his years of traumatic silence, his immediate suggestion that they invite the family for a visit, proving that he had internalized the lessons of healing and bridge building that defined their shared mission. Adrian joined their impromptu planning session with proposals for expanding the estate's facilities to accommodate more diverse supernatural needs, his political connections within vampire society making it possible to create safe spaces for children whose abilities might otherwise make them targets for those who feared change and integration. The work they had begun with one traumatized child was expanding into a movement that could reshape supernatural society's relationship with human civilization, their success with Marcus proving that love and patience could overcome even the deepest magical trauma when applied with wisdom and consistency. Emma looked around the breakfast table where her unconventional family gathered each morning to plan their day's activities, seeing in Marcus's animated discussion of teaching techniques and Adrian's careful attention to security considerations, the foundation of something that could outlast any individual crisis and provide hope for generations of supernatural children yet to be born. The transformation from desperate intervention to sustainable institution had been gradual but irreversible, each success building toward greater ambitions, and each healed child becoming an advocate for others facing similar struggles. Marcus's suggestion that they develop a formal training program for supernatural parents who wanted to learn better communication techniques with traumatized children showed how completely he had internalized the partnership model that defined their family structure. His own healing journey, making him a powerful example of what was possible when love replaced fear as the driving force in supernatural child development. The afternoon found Emma in her study, working on the sequel to her disguised autobiography. This new book focusing on the practical aspects of building supernatural human educational partnerships and the policy changes needed to protect hybrid children from the political forces that had once threatened Marcus's safety. Adrian's contributions to the manuscript reflected his deep understanding of vampire law and supernatural politics, while Marcus provided insights into the daily reality of living between worlds that academic theory could never capture with such clarity and emotional truth. The evening reading session that concluded each day had become a cherished ritual, not just for the children who attended their program, but for Emma herself, the gentle rhythm of storytelling and shared imagination providing the same comfort and connection that had first drawn her to Marcus's bedside 3 years earlier. As she settled into her familiar chair and opened that evening's chosen book, Emma felt Marcus take his customary place beside her, while Adrian dimmed the lights to the perfect level for mixed human and vampire audiences, their coordination unconscious and practiced after months of shared routines. The story that unfolded that evening was one of Emma's own creation, a tale about a princess who discovered that her greatest power lay not in magic spells or inherited authority, but in her ability to see the good in others and help them see it in themselves. A narrative that resonated with children whose own gifts had been misunderstood by those who should have nurtured them. Marcus's voice joined hers at key moments in the story, their vocal harmony reflecting the deeper partnership that had made possible not just his healing, but the broader mission they now shared of creating safe spaces for supernatural children who needed examples of successful integration between worlds. As Emma's eyelids grew heavy with the familiar drowsiness that marked the end of another fulfilling day, she heard Marcus take over the story's conclusion with the confidence of someone who had found his own voice and learned to use it in service of others who struggled to find theirs. "And they all lived happily ever after," Marcus whispered as Emma stirred awake in her chair. But this time, the traditional fairy tale ending reflected genuine reality rather than wishful thinking, their happiness hard-won through courage and commitment rather than magical transformation or princely rescue. Adrian moved quietly to bank the fire and secure the library for the night, while Emma and Marcus gathered the scattered books and settled the younger children who had fallen asleep during the story, their evening routine reflecting the deep trust and affection that had grown between three individuals who had chosen to become family, despite every obstacle supernatural society had placed in their path. The last image Emma retained as she finally headed toward her own bed was the sight of Marcus tucking a blanket around a sleeping vampire child, while Adrian checked the window wards that protected all the children in their care from those who might wish them harm, the two of them working together with the automatic coordination that marked their evolution from isolated individuals to integral parts of a family unit that had redefined what was possible for supernatural society.